In the scorching summer of the year 363, the most powerful army Rome had assembled in a generation marched deeper into the Persian desert, convinced it was about to write history in the image of Alexander the Great. 65,000 soldiers, veterans of Gaul, masters of siege, the finest legions the empire had produced in decades. At their head rode Julian, emperor, philosopher, and soldier, a man who believed the gods of Rome still favored the bold. But the desert had heard that story before, and somewhere beyond the shimmering heat, a trap older than empire was already closing. The first horn came from the rear, then the second from the left. Then the ground itself seemed to tremble. Persian cavalry exploded out of the dust like a wave of iron and thunder. Elephants, war elephants, their armored hides catching the midday sun, their screams tearing through the formation. The Romans scrambled to form ranks in the blinding heat. Javelins fell, men collapsed, horses screamed and reared, shields cracked under the weight of lances, and then the emperor himself, without armor, without his breastplate, appeared in the chaos, riding toward the sound of the dying. A single spear hissed through the dust. It found him. When the desert finally went still, a Roman emperor lay dying in his tent. Not defeated by Shapur's armies in open battle, not brought low by siege or treachery, brought down by a single moment of reckless courage, far from home, in the burning heart of Persia. And the echo of that afternoon would reshape the world for centuries to come. By the middle of the 4th century of the Christian era, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads it had been approaching for generations. The eastern frontier, a vast and contested boundary stretching from the mountains of Armenia down through the burning plains of Mesopotamia, had never been truly pacified. For more than a century, the Sassanid Persian Empire had been Rome's most capable and dangerous adversary, a civilization of equal discipline, equal ambition, and far older pride. The Sassanids, who had overthrown the Parthians more than a century earlier, had built an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the edges of Central Asia. Their king, Shapur II, was no ordinary ruler. He had been fighting Rome since before Julian was born, a warrior king who had humiliated Emperor Valerian in the year 260, capturing him alive in battle, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by an enemy in the field. That memory still burned in the Roman consciousness like a brand pressed deep into living flesh. For decades, the eastern provinces of Rome had bled. Sassanid raids struck deep into Syria and Anatolia. Cities burned, ransoms were paid, fortresses changed hands like dice thrown on a table. The town of Nisibis, that great walled bulwark of the eastern frontier, had been besieged 3 times by Shapur and held 3 times by Roman arms. Each defense bought time, but time was running out. The Eastern Empire was tired, and its fatigue showed in the drawn faces of its generals and the rotting timbers of its frontier forts. When Julian took the throne in 361, he inherited not only an empire, but a wound. The East was still bleeding, the frontier was exhausted, and the man who would be emperor had a vision that went far beyond defense. He wanted to end the Persian question permanently. He wanted to march to Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, break the walls of the empire that dared to defy Rome, and return as the second Alexander. It was an ambition as old as Rome's eastern dreams and as dangerous as the desert itself. Flavius Claudius Julianus was born in the year 331 into the blood and paranoia of the Constantinian dynasty. His father was Julius Constantius, half-brother of Constantine the Great. When Constantine died, the succession was settled in massacre. Julian's father and most of his male relatives were executed by rivals for the throne. Julian himself survived only because he was too young to be considered a threat, and perhaps because someone with influence chose mercy over thoroughness. He grew up in isolation, first in Cappadocia, then in other estates far from the center of power, watched but not imprisoned, educated but not trusted. He read Greek philosophy, studied Plato and the Neoplatonists, absorbed the old Roman religious traditions that were rapidly being displaced by Christianity. He was, at heart, a scholar who happened to be born into a world of emperors, and that duality would define everything he became and everything he failed to become. When his cousin, Emperor Constantius II, assigned him to command Roman forces in Gaul as a junior Caesar, no one expected much. Julian had spent his life in libraries, not on battlefields. But he surprised everyone, himself most of all. In 357, at the Battle of Argentoratum on the Rhine, he led Roman legions to a decisive victory over the Alemanni, a confederacy of Germanic tribes that had been raiding deep into Gaul for years. His soldiers adored him. He shared their rations, slept outside in winter, and marched on foot when the mud grew too deep for horses. In 361, when Constantius died of fever before a civil war between the two cousins could be fought, Julian became sole emperor of Rome. He was 30 years old. He moved quickly. He reversed the Christian-favoring policies of his predecessors. He restored pagan temples and cults. He withdrew imperial support from Christian clergy. He was not violent in his persecution, but he was unmistakable in his intention. Rome, under Julian, would remember its gods. He called himself a servant of Helios, the sun, a devotee of the old divine order that had guided Rome from the time of Romulus to the time of Augustus. His detractors, the Christians who would write his legacy in ink for centuries afterward, gave him a different name, the apostate. On the other side of the Euphrates, Shapur II had been ruling Persia for more than 40 years. He was, by any measure, one of the most formidable rulers of antiquity. Crowned, according to tradition, before he was even born, a crown placed upon his mother's womb, in a ceremony of extraordinary symbolic power, he had grown into a king of iron will and tactical patience. He understood the rhythms of war, the way a musician understands tempo. He knew when to press and when to withdraw, when to offer battle and when to melt away into the dust and let the desert do the killing for him. Shapur's forces were organized around the Samarra, the elite Persian heavy cavalry, mounted on massive armored horses, each rider encased in scale mail, armed with lance and sword, trained from childhood to fight as a single devastating unit. Supporting them were horse archers of extraordinary skill, formations of armored war elephants, and infantry of diverse origin drawn from across the vast empire. He had also employed Arab auxiliaries from the Lakhmid Confederation, desert fighters who knew the terrain between the two rivers, the way a farmer knows his own field in the dark. Shapur knew Julian was coming. He had time to prepare. And preparation, in the hands of a man who had been preparing for war his entire life, is its own kind of weapon. In early March of the year 363, the Roman army left Antioch. It was the largest force Rome had assembled for an eastern campaign in living memory. 65,000 soldiers marched under the imperial eagle, plus a fleet of more than 700 vessels of varying size, supply ships, warships, and pontoon bridges loaded onto flatboats, ready to cross any river Persia could put between Rome and its capital. Julian had prepared with the thoroughness of a man who believed history was watching. He had reorganized the Eastern legions over the previous year, weeded out officers he considered incompetent, and brought in veterans from his campaigns in Gaul. He had also brought with him a man named Hormisdas, a Persian prince and brother of Shapur, who had defected to Rome decades earlier. Hormisdas was Julian's political weapon, a living alternative to Shapur, proof that the campaign was not merely conquest, but liberation of Persia from a tyrannical king. Julian split his force. 30,000 men under his cousin Procopius were sent north to link with Rome's Armenian allies and approach Persia from the highlands, threatening the eastern flank. Julian himself would lead the main army down the Euphrates, sweep past the great Persian fortresses, and converge on Ctesiphon in a pincer movement that would give Shapur no angle from which to exploit the situation. The early weeks of the campaign were a revelation. The Sassanid forces did not offer major resistance as the Roman columns moved south. Persian-held cities fell or surrendered. Supplies came from the ships moving down the Euphrates beside the marching legions. Julian's mood was electric. He sacrificed to the gods at every opportunity, interpreted the omens himself, and wrote dispatches back to Rome describing the campaign in almost mystical terms. This was not merely war. This was destiny reclaiming its course. But then the fleet reached the walls of Ctesiphon. The great capital sat on the eastern bank of the Tigris. Massive walls, towers of fired brick. Shapur had concentrated his forces there, daring Julian to assault. The Roman army won an engagement outside the walls, a sharp and costly fight against a Sassanid force that had sallied out to engage them. But the walls themselves were a different matter. The engineers studied them, the generals conferred through the night, and the conclusion was grim. Without siege engines adequate for a city of that scale, without the northern army of Procopius that had still not arrived, a direct assault on Ctesiphon would be a catastrophe that no subsequent victory could redeem. Julian paused, and in that pause, Persia breathed. Then came the decision that would seal his fate. Julian ordered the fleet burned. More than 70 transport and supply ships were set alight on the 16th of June. The flames rose in columns of black smoke, visible for miles in every direction. Some accounts say Julian believed the ships were too vulnerable, that they might fall into Persian hands, that marching north to link with Procopius required speed and freedom from the burden of a large fleet. Others say he was misled by Persian advisors who had secretly switched their allegiance back to Shapur and convinced Julian the march would be easy. Whatever the reason, when those fires died on the surface of the Tigris, there was no going back. The army that had swept so confidently down the Euphrates now had to march north through Persia on foot, through a land the Sassanids were already salting behind them. Shapur's scorched earth policy was immediate and total. Crops were burned, villages emptied before the Romans could reach them. Wells were fouled, granaries destroyed before Roman scouts could arrive. The Persian cavalry did not give battle, not yet. They harassed. They appeared at the edges of the column, killed stragglers, and vanished. They struck the rear at dusk and the flanks at dawn. They were everywhere and nowhere, a maddening and bleeding presence that could not be brought to decisive engagement, and the desert heat of June in Mesopotamia was a weapon no Roman legion had trained to fight. The army began to suffer. Food ran low. Men collapsed from heat and dehydration. Morale, that invisible architecture upon which every army stands, cracked under the weight of days without victory and nights without rest. Julian drove his men forward. He walked among them, shared their privation, refused comforts that a lesser emperor would have insisted upon. He was trying to hold together something that was beginning to come apart at its seams. On the 22nd of June, near a place called Maranga, the Sassanids finally accepted a set-piece engagement. Shapur sent forward his Savaran cavalry, supported by armored elephants and horse archers. Julian formed his men into a crescent, a defensive arc that absorbed the Persian charge and allowed the Romans to rush the archers before they could bleed the formation apart with distance fire. The Romans won the day. It was a genuine tactical victory, but Shapur withdrew in good order. The bulk of his army was intact, and the retreating Romans had food for perhaps a few more days. The victory at Maranga changed nothing. The trap was still closing. 4 days after Maranga, on the 26th of June, in the year 363, the Roman army moved cautiously northeast in square formations through the arid hills south of the city that would one day be called Samara. The sun was already ferocious by mid-morning. The men moved slowly, the weight of armor and exhaustion dragging at every step. The land around them was empty, or seemed to be. Gullies and ridges broke the terrain into pockets of shadow and concealment. The air shimmered with heat that distorted distances and made shadows dance. Julian had removed his breastplate in the heat. He rode without it, something his bodyguards noted with alarm, but did not dare protest to an emperor in motion. The first alarm came from the rear of the column. Persian cavalry, the Samarra, had materialized out of the dust and struck the rear guard. Javelins fell into the marching formation. Men broke ranks. The rear collapsed into defensive clusters. Julian heard the horns from far forward in the column. He did not wait. He wheeled his horse and rode back at speed, into the sound of the fighting, into the chaos that was unfolding behind him. He arrived to find the rear guard scrambling to hold its shape. He rode into the disorder, calling out to soldiers, raising morale by the sheer force of imperial presence. The Romans steadied. The Samarra, seeing the formation reforming, began to pull back. For a moment, it seemed the crisis was passing. The emperor turned toward the retreating cavalry with his sword raised. "Follow them. Do not let them reset." He spurred his horse into the pursuit. Then a second alarm, from the vanguard this time, a warning that changed everything. The Persians had not merely attacked the rear, they had circled the entire column. While the Samarra pressed from behind, another force had ridden ahead, occupying the Roman route in front. The army was surrounded, front, rear, and both flanks. The square formation that had saved them at Maranga was now a cage of men with nowhere to move. War elephants appeared on the left flank. Massive, armored, bellowing, their riders launching arrows from howdahs on their backs, their sheer bulk threatening to scatter the infantry that could not move far enough to the right to avoid them. The Roman left flank bent. Men broke. Julian rode toward it. He was riding without armor, in the midst of a collapse, through a churning mass of cavalry and infantry, trying to hold together an army that the desert, hunger, and the patience of Shapur II had spent a month reducing to its breaking point. From somewhere in the dust, a spear came. Ammianus Marcellinus, who was present on the campaign and wrote the most detailed surviving account of these events, recorded that the weapon struck Julian in the side, below the ribs, piercing through to the liver. The blow was delivered by an unknown hand. Ammianus himself could not say with certainty who threw it. His physician, Oribasius, later concluded the most likely assailant was a Saracen auxiliary, an Arab warrior fighting under the Lakhmid banner in Persian service. Some ancient sources, Christian ones, whispered darkly about a spear thrown from within the Roman ranks, a soldier of the new faith, removing a pagan emperor in a moment that history would not record cleanly. The truth has never been established. The dust of Samara kept its secret. What is known is that Julian fell from his horse. His bodyguards surrounded him and drove away the nearest enemies with brutal speed. They carried him back from the fighting. He tried to return to the battle. His own men restrained him. The wound was deep. The spear had been removed and blood was flowing fast and without stopping. He was taken to his tent. The battle continued without its emperor, swirling in the dust and heat until darkness finally separated the armies. It was inconclusive. The Persians withdrew. The Romans held the field. In any other campaign, it might have been counted as a draw, but in this one, the result was determined not by the counting of the dead, but by what lay in the imperial tent at the center of the exhausted camp. Julian, the last pagan emperor, the philosopher who had wanted to be Alexander, lay on a cot in a desert far from Rome. His officers gathered in the lamplight. Priests offered to summon a Christian baptism. He refused, as those who knew him always knew he would. Those who were present that night reported that he spoke with remarkable composure, discussing philosophy with the scholars he had kept at his side throughout the entire campaign, exploring the nature of the soul, the relationship between courage and fate, the question of whether death was to be feared or accepted as a natural homecoming. He asked for water. He drank. He spoke again of the things he believed, and sometime in the hours before dawn, the bleeding that had begun in the dust outside Samara did not stop. The accounts of his last words differ by source and by faith. Christian writers, who despised everything Julian had stood for, would later attribute to him a final admission that shattered every pagan hope. As he scooped his own blood from the wound and cast it into the air above him, he is said to have cried out the phrase that would outlive him by centuries, that would echo through theological and political debate for more than 1,000 years. "You have won, Galilean." An acknowledgement, real or invented, that the God he had spent his reign fighting had prevailed after all. Julian the Apostate died on the night of the 26th of June, 363. He was 31 years old. He had been sole emperor of Rome for less than 2 years. Dawn came to the Roman camp like an accusation. The commanders assembled in the grey light of early morning, men who had followed their emperor from Antioch to the gates of Ctesiphon and now found themselves leaderless, deep in enemy territory, without adequate food, surrounded by a Persian army that had not finished its work. Julian had named no successor. In the confidence and haste of his campaign preparations, the question of succession had been deferred, as though the act of naming an heir would admit the possibility of failure, and failure was something Julian had refused to contemplate. Now his officers paid the price of that omission in the hardest currency history offers. The choice fell to Jovian, the commander of Julian's domestic guard, a Christian, a soldier without philosophical pretension, chosen precisely because he was acceptable to every faction in the divided command structure. He was proclaimed emperor before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. His inheritance was dire. The army was exhausted, hungry, and surrounded. Shapur's forces closed in around the halting Roman column as it tried to construct a bridge across the Tigris. The bridge failed. The Persians drew the noose tighter. Envoys arrived from Shapur bearing terms. Jovian, who had provisions for perhaps 5 days, accepted without hesitation. The peace of the year 363 was the most humiliating agreement Rome had signed with Persia in its history. The city of Nisibis, that great fortress that had resisted Shapur 3 times, was surrendered. So was Singara. 15 other fortresses along the frontier were handed over. Eastern Mesopotamia passed to Persian control. Rome renounced its alliance with Armenia, leaving that kingdom exposed to Sassanid annexation. In exchange, the Roman army was allowed to march home. The soldiers walked back through the eastern desert in silence. Those who had been born in Nisibis and were now forbidden by treaty to bring their families when they departed, wept openly at the city's gates. The city that had never fallen in battle was abandoned without a siege. The walls that had held against Shapur's greatest assaults still stood, but they flew Persian banners now. Julian's body was carried home and buried in Tarsus, in the province of Cilicia, in a tomb that his admirers would visit for generations, mourning not only the emperor, but the world he had tried to call back from the edge of memory. The death of Julian near Samara in the summer of 363 was not merely the end of a campaign, it was the closing of a door that has never been opened again. Julian was the last emperor of Rome to genuinely attempt to reverse the Christianization of the empire. He did not succeed, and his death accelerated the very process he had tried to halt. Within 2 decades, under Emperor Theodosius the Great, paganism would be officially suppressed. The temples Julian had reopened were closed again, permanently. The priests he had restored were silenced. The old gods, which had guided Rome from the time of its founding through 8 centuries of conquest and catastrophe, were outlawed and then forgotten. The territory lost in the peace Jovian signed was never fully recovered. Nisibis remained in Persian hands for centuries, The balance of power on the eastern border shifted in ways that would haunt Rome's successors for generations. The Armenian kingdom, abandoned by treaty, fell into Sassanid influence, complicating Byzantine policy for more than 100 years. But there is something more in the story of Julian and Samara than the arithmetic of battles won and territories lost. There is the image of a man who believed that the destiny of Rome was written in its past, that the gods of Augustus and Caesar were still present, still capable of guiding the empire back to greatness, if only an emperor with enough courage and philosophy and love of the ancient world would show the way. He was wrong about many things. He miscalculated the strength of Persia and the weakness of his own supply lines. He overestimated the speed at which his campaign could converge. He burned his fleet on advice that may have been treachery dressed as counsel. He rode without armor into the dust of battle. But he was also a man of extraordinary rarity in any age, an emperor who read Plato before he slept, who marched on foot with his soldiers through the mud of winter campaigns, who believed that the purpose of power was not comfort or glory, but something more difficult and more enduring. He wanted Rome to remember what it had been. He wanted the old fires to burn again. The desert outside Samara remembered nothing. The Tigris flowed south, as it always had. The dust settled and the heat rose again, indifferent to the empires that argued over its surface. A spear had come from the dust. It had found an emperor riding without armor. And the world changed direction in an instant, not because of a great army, not because of a brilliant strategy, not because of the will of Shapur or the skill of the Savaran, but because of a single unguarded moment in the life of a man who thought he was Alexander. The echo of that spear still moves through the corridors of history. It separated the ancient world from everything that came after. On one side of that afternoon in the Persian dust, Rome still dreamed in the language of its gods. On the other side, the old fires went out one by one, and the long twilight of antiquity, which had been approaching for years, finally began.